Treasurer Wayne Swan has been driving the government's efforts to stave off recession. He joins us now in our Parliament House studio. Treasurer, good morning.
Good morning, Fran.
Treasurer, if we've come back from the abyss, are we safe?
Well, we're certainly not out of the woods, Fran, and that is exactly the case. And I see this morning that President Obama has made some statements and put out an evaluation of where we are. And he made the point that we just can't be complacent. You can't go through an event of this size globally, a synchronised global recession, sharp contractions in the December quarter, very sharp contractions in the March quarter, and think that things will quickly revive. Yes, there are some encouraging signs out there, but the lesson from the G20 finance ministers meeting the weekend before last in London was that we must maintain stimulus and that also we shouldn't repeat the mistakes of the past by slamming on the brakes too quickly.
Treasurer, I want to ask you to cast your mind back a year ago. What was your first thought when Lehmans crashed?
Well, I thought, the world economy is probably going to turn upside down. We had already been through a series of very significant events in the US financial sector through August. And of course, then, as we went through September and into October, things just got worse and worse. And it is, as the Prime Minister was saying in question time yesterday, advanced economies were staring into a very deep abyss. I will never forget being at the emergency meeting of G20 finance ministers in early October in Washington. And as I sat around that room looking into the eyes of my fellow finance ministers, I saw fear. Fear about the future, fear for the future of the world economy. And it was that assessment of how deep this downturn was becoming that drove these very substantial actions which were taken by individual countries and then by the G20, particularly through March this year, that have produced a situation where the world contraction was not as sharp as it could have been. It is the case that coordinated action through the G20 avoided an economic catastrophe.
And were you frightened? Did you have fear in your heart? Here you were, the Treasurer of Australia at this point. Did you have sleepless nights over the right way forward?
I was deeply concerned, as was the government, deeply concerned about what could happen to Australia if we didn't take and put in place very substantial policy actions which would cushion our economy from this tsunami that was emerging from advanced economies in the beginning and then developing economies soon after.
1 year on, the global financial crisis seems to be receding, but some economists fear it risks morphing into a global government debt crisis. Now, you say that debt poses no real risk for Australia, but what about the rest of the world? In the US, the budget deficit is running at $1.5 trillion. That's 11% of US GDP. Are you concerned that America's debt problems may thwart its long-term recovery and thus the recovery of the rest of the world?
Well, Fran, the global economy is not going to be the same as we go forward from here as it was prior to the global financial crisis, which turned into a global recession. The American consumer is not going to be driving global growth. And there will need to be substantial structural adjustment in advanced economies, particularly those that are in deficit, and also structural adjustment in developing economies which have been in surplus. It is just the case that the American consumer won't continue to drive growth. Growth will increasingly have to come from other countries, not just those that were consuming, if you like, and pushing global growth higher at the top of the boom. That will mean a substantial rebalancing in the nature of global growth. The good news for us is that in the middle of all this, it is the case that Asia has greater potential to grow, and we are ideally located to take advantage of what will surely be the Asian century.
It's 23 minutes to 8 on breakfast. Our guest this morning is Treasurer Wayne Swan. Treasurer, earlier we spoke with the US economist Robert Reich. He says the lessons haven't been learnt and the American economy is heading for a double-dip recession. Let's have a listen.
I see a little bit of a rally toward the end of this year, early next year, but the fundamentals will not have changed at all. The fundamentals being stagnant wages, job insecurity, widening inequality, and therefore not enough money in most people's pockets to buy. We're probably going to see in the year 2011 a falling back into recession.
Now, to some extent, that's pretty much the same picture you just painted, but do you fear a global double-dip recession?
Well, that's a very gloomy forecast, and it is one shared by some economists. But I'm a bit more optimistic than that commentator. The fact is that very substantial policy support and stimulus has been put in the system for very good reason. And the US stimulus package is still flowing through that economy. And of course, as it flows through, it lessens the impact on employment, and of course, or on unemployment, and it supports the economy through a difficult period. That's important because that in itself has an impact on confidence. And you can see that in some markets around the world there is a revival of confidence. It's important, therefore, that in this environment, where things are delicate, if you like, that the economic stimulus and support for the economy that has been put in place in advanced economies, not just in the United States but elsewhere as well, continues to boost that confidence to get us through what is a very difficult period. But beyond the next year or so, it is the case there will be adjustments that will need to take place in advanced economies, and most particularly in the United States. And as President Obama has made very clear this morning, also important that we don't lose momentum when it comes to global reform of supervision and regulation of the financial system. All of these things have to be put in place because as they go in place and stay in place, they have a confidence effect on their own.
And I'll come to that in just a minute, but your message has been that the adjustments that will need to take place will bring some pain. The recovery will be modest in a sense. You also say the era of cheap money is over. Does that mean we're going to add interest rate rises to the mix of this painful period that we're about to head into, and that interest rates will never be as low as perhaps they were, not just right now in the midst of this crisis, but even as they were, 8 months ago?
Well, we're not going back to an era of cheap money. I mean, that's what regulation and reform of the global financial system will mean, that we have to price risk appropriately. But it is the case that, therefore, that money won't be as cheap globally as it has been at the height of the boom prior to this global financial crisis. But insofar as your question relates to Australia, I'd just like to make a couple of very simple points. I mean, interest rates, the cash rate in this country is at emergency lows. It is at 50-year lows. We've seen a cut to the cash rate of something like 425 basis points. To someone with a mortgage of $300,000, that's worth something like $9,000 a year. It will be the case that as the global economy begins to recover, as our economy begins to recover, the Reserve Bank will make adjustments to that emergency level from time to time, just as the government is making adjustments, particularly to its stimulus package, as we go through and private demand revives. The stimulus package has reached its peak in the middle of this year and through the end of this year, and begins to be wound back as we go through next year as private demand revives. So basically, the fiscal and monetary stimulus that is put into the system is wound back as the private sector revives, because, Fran, that is how monetary and fiscal policy works. Change
does need to happen. There does need to be regulatory reform. That's on the agenda at the G20 meeting in Pittsburgh next week. I'm just wondering whether you fear, though, that as the global financial system starts to recover, the share markets rally, that the zeal for reform is fading a little.
I think President Obama was referring to that this morning in his comments. I think it is important that we maintain the momentum for reform, particularly of the global financial system, but not just regulation and supervision of international financial institutions. It's also important that we continue to finance and reform our international financial institutions such as the IMF, and it's also important that we have a discussion globally amongst G20 countries about the nature of growth that will follow this global event. That's why there is a very substantial discussion going on as to what will be the sources of growth in the global economy as we move forward.
Treasurer, thank you very much for your time today.
Good to be with you.
I know it's a busy day. We better let you go. That's Treasurer Wayne Swan. It's 18 to 8 on Breakfast.